So it's almost a month now since I returned from China. And for those of you who don't know, I was working there in a large high school in Guizhou province, Kaili City, Guizhou province. It was a wonderful experience. Due to unforeseen circumstances, I had to leave the country early. But I'm not going to repeat everything I said around that. What I want to focus on in this video is the approach to education in both East and West, and where I think there are strengths and weaknesses on both sides. Just try and balance my laptop here. Actually, that might be better rather than balancing on my knee. There we go. Okay, there's a few disclaimers I want to make before I go ahead with this. This might be a little bit of a long video because I want to cover a number of aspects of both sides, but I'll try and make it as condensed as possible. Few disclaimers. It's not quite black and white. It's not a case that the East is all one specific model and the West is all one specific education model. That's not the case. There is variation from country to country, and there is even variation within countries. Um, what I don't want to do in this video is get into a comprehensive layout of different types of schools and that sort of thing. It's because it's not what the video is about, and I think it would just be too time consuming. I want to speak more in generic terms um, about the philosophy, I guess, of education. So I've more direct experience with the Eastern system, and this is a very generic term. I should really be specific and say the Chinese education system, but some of the principles in that can be found in South Korea, in Taiwan, and other parts of Asia. Um, and I think that it's it's kind of a model that is echoed in each country on some level. And that model is very much about proficiency of results. So there is an enormous drive in the Asian education systems, plural, for really focusing on grades and exam marks. And that, from my point of view, is where a lot of the focus lies. Now, my own reception from students was overwhelmingly a good one. I'm not going to say that I never had, as a teacher, discipline issues. There were a few times I did have to raise my voice because I had situations, for example, where I was doing group work, and the idea would be at the end of the lesson we would review what each group had come up with. And sometimes I did get a little bit irritated when the kids that I was working with, they were just talking over each other, and I had to keep reminding them, look, it's not for my sake. You're being rude to each other. But they just wouldn't be quiet. And that was irritating, but that was about the extent of discipline issues I had. There were one or two kids who were a little bit, we would say in British English, smart Alex. You could tell they were sort of testing the boundaries a little bit. But for the most part, I never felt as a teacher that either A, I had a loss of control, or B, that there was any reason to fear anything. And that sounds like hyperbole, but I think there's parts of the world where teachers actually do fear going into the classroom, and that's a complete travesty. It should never be that way. But in terms of discipline, I didn't think it was a major issue. I never had to deal with a fight. In my last school, I worked in China 6 years ago. I did have one fight, and that was two boys at the back of the class. And it was a real fight. It was a proper fist fight. What happened, it transpired, was that they got frustrated. It was a hot day. There was limited space, um, which is probably a different reason than you would get fights in Western schools. In Western schools, it tends to be either gang related, or perhaps in a more old-fashioned sense, fighting over a boy or a girl, or just over something daft. Fights are definitely more common from what I see, from what I remember at school. My school wasn't a particularly rough school, but we had at least a fight a month, I would say, in the schoolyard. And that's kind of, you see it in any film set in a high school. any American or British film that is set in a high school, you can guarantee at least one scene is going to feature a fight, and that's realistic because there are. That is that is life in Western high schools, any schools for that matter. In China, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, and I can hardly judge a huge country based on one high school or technically three high schools that I've been in, but I think overall that is the first thing you notice. There is not the same level of behavioural problems. Now, one area that is a truly universal problem is school bullying. I never personally witnessed it in my classes. There were a few situations where I sort of thought, well, this is maybe a situation I need to keep an eye on, where one student was kind of being teased by others, and I thought, well, I'll kind of keep an eye on this, see if it's a consistent problem, if it happens in the next class. And if it did, I would definitely have intervened. But that never happened. It was a case of one student would be kind of teased one day and he or she would be laughing, but then it would be someone else the next day. So I never saw a consistent situation where one student was being picked on. I definitely would have intervened if I'd seen that. Um, I've never taught in a British school. I have worked as an exam invigilator. I've worked in a one-to-one capacity. I've worked as an exam reader, that is, helping students with some special needs, basically, literally reading questions in an exam, just the questions. Um, but I've never actually taught in a Western classroom, so I have to be upfront about that. Perhaps I can make another video years down the line if I have experience actually teaching a Western classroom. So I also want to be upfront about that. Nevertheless, I'm British. I've grown up with the British education system, um, and without question, I think there is a lack of respect in our system now. It's been quite a few years since I was in high school. I'm 33 years old. I left university in 2006, which means I left sixth form college in 2004. That's now 15 years ago. 15 years ago. It's a long time. But I don't think the situation, if anything, it's possibly got worse. I don't know. I want to be careful here. I don't want to. I think sometimes when we talk about these East versus West situations, I think sometimes there's a tendency for us to almost demonize Western students as all being bad kids. Far from it. There's many intelligent, decent young people, and I think it's a mistake to demonize young people in that way, sort of generalize them in a sense. But without question, there's a different environment, and I think one of the biggest issues in the West is that teachers are not empowered. I think this has been a long-standing problem. Teachers are not empowered to have control. I mean, I'll give an example. If you have a situation, let's say in an all-girls school, and a group of girls are bullying another girl, which is very possible because bullying in girls' schools is rife. Now, let's say you have a male teacher. That male teacher obviously wouldn't want to see bullying in his class, but he would be reluctant to physically intervene and stop the bullies attacking the other girl because they are female students, because he would fear a lawsuit from their parents. But to use an American expression, he would fear legal action if he touched them. Now, my instinct as a teacher, if I see a group of students, physically attacking another student, my instinct would be to physically, take them off. But I think a male teacher would be reluctant to do that with female students. I suppose you could argue you could go and get female colleagues, but this just is an example of what I'm talking about. Teachers fear legal restrictions, and I think there are too many legal restrictions on teachers. I mean, some of it is justified because obviously you don't want someone who's dangerous around children. You don't want someone who's a sex offender or something like that. But I do think it has gone too far the other way, where teachers have no empowerment to take action. So the guiding ethos of the Western education systems has long been on individuality. like creative individuality. Now that has its place, and I'm going to come to where I'm critical of the Asian system, but I think this focus on individuality also leads to a situation that actually takes away individual responsibility. Now, like I say, I haven't taught in a Western classroom. This is just my outlook as an observer from what I have seen in documentaries, in my own experience as a student. I think teachers need to be given far more empowerment to take action when it's necessary, to intervene in bullying. I think one reason why bullying is so rife in Western schools, I mean, it's a problem in Asian schools as well, but I think the reason it's partly so rife is the bullies are smug. They know they'll get away with it. There's too much of a focus on we need to understand them. And there's too often a dismissal of bullying. It's put down to two students having an argument, and it isn't seen for what it is, which is abusive, destructive behavior. It's a horrible thing, and it can destroy lives. Um, so I think there needs to be a lot more empowerment of teachers to take action when it's necessary. I think there needs to be a situation where students are left in no doubt who is in charge. Now, that's not to say that all teachers are pushovers, and they're not. It's just that they have their hands tied. Of course, you don't want to go in too far the other way. You know, I've heard horror stories of, for example, my father had a terrible teacher who actually put salt into his school dinner as a sort of petty punishment. So that sort of stuff is just plain abuse. Um, I don't necessarily favour the reintroduction of corporal punishment. I think that can lead to all sorts of problems. I don't favour that. I'm not in favour of physical punishment in general, but I do think that if you have, for example, a gang problem in a school, if you have a situation, I mean, we've had some terrible things happen in this country. There was in the mid 1990s, I believe it was 1995, there was a London head teacher was stabbed to death because he tried to protect a student from a gang that was picking on that student, and the gang stabbed him. And that was a major, very high profile case. I forget the man's name now, but that drew a lot of attention to the issue of behaviour in schools. About 4 years ago, I believe, there was a teacher stabbed to death in Leeds. So I don't think British schools are quite as tough as American schools. I mean, there's all these films like Dangerous Minds, 187, you know, that show teachers going into real hellhole situations. And they're usually inspiring films about how the teachers turn the students around. I mean, I like Dangerous Minds. It's one of my favorite films, but to what extent it's realistic? Well, it's based on diary extracts of Luann Johnson. But what I really want to talk about here is I think there's two extremes. Now, for it's now 13 minutes into the video, I've spoken a lot about the problem in the Western system where I don't think teachers have anywhere near enough empowerment. Well, we do have serious discipline problems where you get a situation where individuality is kind of put ahead of individual responsibility. And there's too many education systems in the West that kind of have this idea of no one is to blame, which is utter nonsense. If students are bullying other students, they need to be held responsible for that behaviour. So I think that's a very real problem. Now, there has been a tendency for some legislators in the West. I think Michael Gove has alluded to this when he was Education Secretary, of copying the Asian model, which is hugely focused on exams. And I'm very critical of that, and I'm going to explain why. When I was in China, the pressure that I saw on my students, and they were grade one students, meaning that they were at the bottom. The school was divided into three grades. They were around 16 years old. They were the sort of the lower level. The grade three students will be doing their Gaokao exams, which is the notoriously tough college entry exams in China. But the truth is, there is enormous pressure across the board in the Chinese education system, and it's similar in South Korea, Japan, and other Asian countries. The pressure that students face is so immense, and the focus is entirely on grades. In other words, you could have a situation where, let's say, you have a class of 50 students, which is the average sort of size. Let's say, I don't know, 45 of those students get 95%. And it doesn't quite work in percentage format, but this is a very loose sort of explanation. Now, let's say the remaining five students only, invert commas, get 85%. They would be really shunned by their teachers, by their parents. So it's this drive almost for perfection. And the way certain Chinese exam questions are worded are just ridiculous because they give the students options. But if you look at the actual questions, they're formatted in a way that several of the possible answers are actually correct. So you have one wrong answer and you can have two right answers, but they have to choose the right answer. In other words, it's basically pot luck. So they could give a perfectly legitimate answer that is grammatically correct, that it makes total sense, but that will be deemed a wrong answer because it's not what the exam board is looking for. Now, that is clearly nonsense. And I've spoken to Chinese colleagues and they even agree that it's ridiculous. And this is the thing about that enormous pressure that the students face because it's the teachers that have to set these exams, because it's the teachers that have to mark the exams, there is therefore enormous pressure on Chinese teachers as well. And their salary isn't wonderful. So the value for work is not, I assume most of my Chinese colleagues were doing it because they, like teachers all across the world, they enjoy doing it. They like um, they get something out of it. And, these are very capable people. I have nothing but praise for my colleagues. They're dedicated, they're hardworking, they're enthusiastic. Um, but I could see the pressure that they faced as well. And I think even the Chinese Education Bureau is gradually realizing that this method of purely focusing on academic grades rather than kind of cultivating individuality, or rather basically just teaching, getting students to garner knowledge, which really should be the core principle of education. I'm very skeptical of the idea that purely focusing on grades should be everything, because you can have a student who works really hard, they get very good grades, but they haven't actually taken anything in because it's just been, pressure from the parents, pressure from their teachers, and they get good grades and they pass, and that's great, but they haven't actually learned anything. So the focus, in my view, should be on knowledge, not on grades. Exams do have their place. You need exams. You need it as a way to evaluate. But I think putting too much focus on exams is a very big mistake. And if anyone thinks, that, oh, it's just a bit of pressure, this causes serious mental health problems. And in the worst scenarios, it can lead to suicide. I think young people should be allowed to be young people. They need free time. Um, So if Michael Gove and others think that copying that model is the way forward, one aspect that I'm very, very critical of, we hear about tiger parenting. I think I made a video about Amy Chua and her controversial philosophy a while back. Well, that can kind of be extended to tiger teaching. Incidentally, not all of my colleagues took that sort of approach. The younger teachers, especially, they're not that stereotype of ultra strict Asian teachers. They're I wouldn't like to say Western approach, but they recognize that that sort of dragon approach doesn't work either. So I basically see two extremes, and I really think it would be a mistake to go down the line of thinking that. I mean, we used to have it in this country. It was called hot housing, and you get it in great literature. A lot of the great writers, their childhood, I believe Charles Dickens went through it, and others. Um, it really does not work. All it does is create enormous unhappiness, enormous pressure, and I think mental health problems. But by the same token, you don't want a situation where there is no responsibility. There's no sort of influencing students to understand that with life comes responsibility. There's perhaps too much of an entitled mentality in the Western education system, for to put it in a very generic way. But like I say, I think it's a mistake to copy this ultra strict or ultra pressurized Asian model. I think both systems have flaws, and I think the best way forward is a sort of like a lot of things, a healthy medium. We need more discipline in the Western system. We need more to give teachers more empowerment to take action when it's necessary and not to constantly fear legal action. Um, but I'm very critical. I mean, there was a school in London. I came across it in the extra supplement in the Times a while back. And this head teacher's got a lot of recognition because her model is ultra strict. I mean, she has a policy of no talking before classes, and students have to line up at the beginning of the day. There's a real focus on ultra disciplinarianism. Now she says this liberates students, and for example, there's certain approaches that she and others, I forget her name now, but she and others would point to that help students. For example, insisting on a school uniform means that you don't get students bullying other students for the type of clothes they're wearing. In other words, you don't get students from a lower economic background are picked on because they're told that, oh, look, your family's poor or something like that. However, I think that teachers need to accept that some schools have a very precise idea of what their uniform should be, and sometimes students are punished because it is not 100% what the school demands. I really think that head teachers who make those sort of demands need to put themselves in the shoes of parents and actually see the parents going out there shopping and trying to find exactly what they're asking for. I think the situations like that, you get head teachers who get a little bit authoritarian and they don't actually look at the obligations that they're putting on parents. They're not putting themselves in the shoes of the parents. So that school in London, like I say, I forget the name. It's some sort of academy. It's been widely praised by conservatives who argue, "Oh, this is the way forward." I have my skepticism, and this is why. I am very, very wary of any sort of drive for perfection. I'm wary of it because it is not the real world. Perfection does not exist. So if you're driving students to get 100% in exams, that is not the real world. There's nothing wrong with encouraging students to do well, encouraging them to improve grades, encouraging them to improve themselves. But I think there's something that is kind of borderline Stepford Wives pushing for perfection, and I am very critical of that. I also would say that it looks, let's say you have a child with learning difficulties, dyslexia. Where does a child like that fit into that sort of model of perfection? Because we are a lot more understanding of those sort of conditions today. But I think that sort of model of looking for perfection would unfairly penalize children who may well be suffering from learning difficulties. I'm not talking necessarily about mental health problem, but I mean, the actress Cara Toynton made a documentary about this. She suffers from dyslexia, and she said that teachers used to just call her bad. They didn't realize it was a legitimate learning condition. So I'm very wary of any sort of drive for perfection, and I think we need to treat that with some cynicism. I mean, I don't want to get into hyperbole, but it's almost like trying to create perfect little people. I have a real problem with that because in the real world, people are not perfect. And if you encourage young minds to think that the only way you can be of value in this world is to be perfect and get perfect grades, I think that's incredibly unhealthy. I think it, breeds potentially a generation of snobs. Now, the other extreme excuse me, the other extreme, of course, is where you're trying to encourage children to have no barriers. And it's like, oh, creativity is the only thing that matters, not discipline, not rules, not laws. So basically, we're looking at two extremes. And I think you have the ultra strict sort of approach, which is entirely results orientated, entirely exam driven, entirely about creating perfect little people. I think that is a very big problem. But there's the other extreme, which is an ultra liberal approach of, you can do what you want, basically. You're a creative individual, and there's no barriers, there is no red lines. that's equally dangerous. So we need to get an approach somewhere around the middle. I'm not going to say I'm the world's best peak teacher, but I would like to think I tried my level best to get a healthy balance. I did have red lines in my class. Now, like I say, in China, I didn't need to use them very much, but I did make it clear that I was in charge. And the end result was I felt that I had a very good rapport with my students, which is extremely important. But I also felt that, it's not just about having a good rapport. I felt my students were learning things. I'm quite content with what they were picking up. Now, I'm going to close with one thing which is particular to the Chinese model, and you can see it in other countries. Because a Kazakh friend of mine recently, I made a Facebook post about this, and she said she agreed absolutely with what I was saying about getting the balance. And she said that in Kazakhstan, there's also, it's similar to China because Kazakhstan's a former communist country. In totalitarian states like in China, there is enormous focus these days. I mean, focusing on China, what you see at every level is party ideology and ultranationalism. That's, in my view, also incredibly dangerous because in China, I mean, individual thinking is definitely frowned upon, and it's definitely something that, critical thinking is not part of the education system. And you might see that in other Asian countries, but particularly in China, which is a single party state. So it's a case of the Communist Party cannot be questioned. I mean, my students literally had every Monday morning, they would have this flag waving ceremony, and it went on for a long time, I guess about 1 hour. It was all sorts of nationalistic slogans, but I'm sure some of it was Xi Jinping thought. And that's what you see happening in the Chinese education system now. I think that's incredibly dangerous because it's injecting, communist ideology into young minds, but it's also injecting nationalism into young minds. And the byproduct of that is you get these students growing up that become university students and they get incredibly defensive whenever the motherland is questioned. But, they think that criticism of the party it equals criticism of China. And that's where you get the little 50 Cent Brigade and these Chinese nationalists that come online. That is a direct product of the Chinese education system. And unfortunately, that has escalated. I've seen it firsthand where you see students. I mean, I was very careful. I never, contradicted them because I didn't want to get myself into hot water. But you would definitely see it coming through sometimes when you would ask students about their opinions, and they came out with basically lines that could have been taken directly from a party manifesto. That's unsettling. So that is definitely something that is problematic in authoritarian states like China. Anyway, this has been a long video, but I think it's all worth considering. Let me know your thoughts. Let me know about the situation in your country. And if you're from a teaching background, if you are a teacher, what do you think? Coming from a teaching background, I really think that it needs to be a healthy middle approach. Teachers need to have empowerment. Students need to know red lines. But young people also need time to themselves. And if you have this situation where you're constantly focused on exams, it's I don't think it creates individual value. I don't think it helps people moving forward in life. I'm sure there's many, many other things that can be said, but I'll leave it there for now. Thanks for watching.